The Prime Minister has just crossed a line that no British leader in modern times has dared touch. For the first time in decades, the very foundations of British democracy are shaking, not from protesters, not from foreign enemies, but from within Downing Street itself. Judges are furious. Lawmakers are panicking. And millions of citizens are now asking one question: can the law still stop power when that power is the Prime Minister? Everything started just days ago with a leaked internal document that revealed the Prime Minister had ignored official legal advice on a controversial executive order. The order, rushed through without proper parliamentary debate, aimed to override existing human rights laws in the name of national emergency security protocols. But what shocked the legal world was that the government's own top legal advisors had warned the order might violate both British law and international treaties. Instead of backing down, the Prime Minister reportedly told aides, "Let them take me to court. I answer to the people, not lawyers." That one sentence lit the fuse. By the next morning, legal experts filed an emergency injunction in the High Court, demanding the order be frozen until a full constitutional review could be conducted. Within 48 hours, the courtroom was packed. Cameras weren't allowed, but reporters described the scene as tense, fiery, and unlike anything seen in decades. The Prime Minister refused to attend or send a legal representative. Instead, he gave a press briefing outside Number 10, declaring the judiciary out of touch with the will of the people. That speech, broadcast across every major news network, instantly triggered mass debate. Supporters called him bold. Critics called him dangerous, but it didn't stop there. The Attorney General, considered one of the Prime Minister's key allies, suddenly resigned, live on national television, stating, "I cannot support a leader who sees himself above the rule of law." Hours later, 2 more cabinet members walked out. That same night, a crowd of nearly 70,000 gathered in Parliament Square. Some held candles. Others held signs that read, "Defend democracy," and "No one is above the law." The mood was a mix of fear, fury, and disbelief. Media across the country exploded. Every major front page asked the same thing in different words: is this the end of rule-based governance in Britain? Political commentators drew comparisons to Watergate, while others went further, pointing to authoritarian shifts seen in countries once considered democracies. As pressure mounted, calls for the Prime Minister's resignation grew louder, not just from opposition leaders, but from members of his own party. Behind closed doors, rumors began to swirl. Some MPs were drafting letters of no confidence, while others secretly approached constitutional lawyers to explore legal removal. To make matters worse, the Supreme Court stepped in. The justices agreed to fast-track a review of the order, but also issued a rare public statement, warning that continued refusal to respect judicial authority could lead to a constitutional rupture. For ordinary people, that statement, filled with calm legal words, sounded like a warning of total chaos. This isn't just another political scandal. This is a direct confrontation between the highest political office in Britain and the very laws that have kept the country stable for centuries. People aren't just worried about policy anymore, they're worried about power, and what happens when that power believes it's untouchable. And it all started with one reckless move, one ignored warning, and one man who believed he was bigger then the law. As the courtrooms filled and protesters marched, the real war began, not with weapons, but with words, law books, and public power. The Prime Minister, once seen as a populist voice for the working class, was now painted by critics as a dangerous man willing to tear apart Britain's legal system to stay in control. And while he told the public that he was defending national security, the legal world was united in another view, that this was a direct challenge to the very foundation of British democracy. Inside Parliament, things turned ugly fast. The opposition parties, Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the Greens, quickly condemned the Prime Minister's move as illegal. But what truly rocked Westminster was the reaction from within his own Conservative Party. More than 30 MPs, including several senior ministers, began openly questioning whether the Prime Minister had gone too far. Lord Heathridge, a Conservative peer and former judge, delivered a powerful speech in the House of Lords. "We do not elect kings in this country. When a Prime Minister turns his back on the law, he turns his back on Britain." At the heart of the legal storm was the government's executive order, which bypassed Parliament and tried to impose emergency rules on immigration, surveillance, and civil protest. Normally, such sweeping actions require debate and legal checks. But the Prime Minister had signed it into law using a rarely used royal prerogative power, a political tool that most modern prime ministers avoid, fearing backlash. Legal scholars, including top professors from Oxford and Cambridge, published letters warning that this action might be constitutionally unlawful and morally indefensible. The High Court moved fast. The judges began reviewing the case within 72 hours. They demanded evidence, communications, and minutes from cabinet meetings. What they found shocked them. Leaked documents suggested that the Prime Minister had been advised multiple times to halt the executive order, not just for legal reasons, but because of the social unrest it might cause. One document, now known as the Pendle Memo, showed that the Home Secretary had warned this action could lead to mass unrest and loss of public trust in institutions. The Prime Minister reportedly wrote one word across the warning: proceed. The legal arguments came down to this: was the Prime Minister allowed to override parliamentary process in the name of emergency powers? And more importantly, who gets to decide what counts as an emergency? The government's lawyers said the threats facing the country, unrest at the borders, economic turmoil, and foreign cyber attacks, were enough to justify swift action. But the opposing side argued that this was a power grab, plain and simple. Lord Justice Fairley, one of the senior judges in the case, said during proceedings, "It is not for one man to decide when the rule of law is suspended." Meanwhile, the Prime Minister doubled down. In a nationally televised address, he declared that the courts were interfering with the government's duty to protect the nation. His speech was filled with patriotic language, words like duty, strength, and sovereignty. But it was what he didn't say that worried many. He gave no clear answer on whether he would obey the court's ruling if it went against him. That silence was deafening. It left one question hanging in the air: what happens when the country's most powerful man refuses to listen to the law? The political atmosphere grew more intense by the hour. Civil servants started leaking information anonymously. One said, "We're watching the collapse of the rules we swore to uphold." Even the police were caught in the middle, unsure whether to enforce the executive order or follow the judge's upcoming decision. Some chiefs issued internal memos telling officers to use discretion. Others threatened to resign, and then came the turning point. The court issued a temporary freeze on the executive order, meaning it had no legal force until the final decision was made. The Prime Minister's response was to call the court unelected elites trying to control the people's will. That statement made headlines around the world. The European Union issued a formal statement urging the UK to respect democratic checks and balances. The United States, normally quiet on UK matters, issued a short but strong message from the State Department: the strength of a democracy is shown by how it respects its laws, even when they are inconvenient. Now, Britain stands divided. On one side, those who believe the Prime Minister is protecting the country in dangerous times. On the other, those who believe he is weakening the nation's most important protection, its legal system. Law versus power. Court versus cabinet. Order versus control. The battle lines are drawn, and there is no turning back. The legal freeze on the Prime Minister's executive order didn't calm the situation, it only poured fuel on a fire already spreading across Britain. Within hours of the High Court's decision, chaos erupted in several major cities. In London, protesters gathered outside Parliament and Downing Street. Some were waving British flags upside down, a signal of national distress. Others held signs reading, "No crown without law," and "This is not a kingdom." In Manchester, Birmingham, and Bristol, spontaneous rallies broke out, and many turned into tense standoffs with police. Across social media, hashtags like #RuleOfLaw, #ResignNowPM, and #Crisis in Downing Street trended globally, but it wasn't just protesters reacting, the government itself began to crack from within. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the most powerful figures in the cabinet, resigned without warning. His letter to the public was scathing: "I cannot, in good conscience, continue to serve a leader who treats the law as an obstacle instead of a foundation." Within a single day, 3 more ministers followed. Several junior MPs from the ruling party went on live television, visibly shaken, saying they were pressured to stay silent. One MP even claimed she had been threatened with losing her seat if she publicly criticized the Prime Minister. Inside Number 10, aides reported confusion, silence, and paranoia. Meetings were being held behind closed doors, with personal phones banned and papers shredded. Whispers of a snap election started to circulate, but no one knew who could even lead the government at this point. Meanwhile, civil service unions declared a vote of no confidence in the government. They accused the administration of abusing executive power and called for a nationwide walkout unless constitutional order was restored. In the House of Commons, things were just as explosive. Opposition leaders demanded immediate action. Labour called for a motion of no confidence. The Liberal Democrats pushed for emergency constitutional hearings. And for the first time, the Speaker of the House publicly warned that Parliament is being cornered by its own executive. Backbenchers from the Prime Minister's own party began crossing the aisle, physically and politically, saying they could no longer support the government unless it agreed to abide by the final court ruling. Outside of government, the cultural impact was growing stronger every day. Prominent musicians, actors, authors, and retired military officers began posting open letters condemning the Prime Minister's actions. The Archbishop of Canterbury released a rare public sermon stating, "No leader is above the law, not in this land, and not in the eyes of God." Faith leaders from other communities joined in, fearing that this political firestorm could lead to division across society. Schools began teaching students about the Magna Carta and the importance of legal equality. In many places, it felt like the country was reliving the very principles it was built on, only this time in real time, under threat. The media played a huge role in shaping public opinion. Conservative-leaning newspapers tried to defend the Prime Minister's intentions, arguing that strong action was needed in uncertain times. But liberal and independent outlets called this a constitutional coup. News programs broadcast live legal analysis, crowd reactions, and political fallout. Every hour brought a new headline. Judiciary cornered. MPs in rebellion. PM silent again. One shocking exposé revealed that the Prime Minister's legal team had already drafted a secret plan to bypass the Supreme Court if the ruling went against him, using a special clause in emergency wartime legislation. That news shook even his staunchest defenders. Internationally, Britain's allies began to grow nervous. The European Court of Human Rights issued a statement warning the UK not to abandon international legal commitments. The United Nations Human Rights Council called an emergency meeting. The Prime Minister of Canada said, "We are watching a friend struggle with its democratic heart." Even the Commonwealth nations, countries that once looked to the UK as a model, began questioning its stability. One African leader commented, "If Britain can fall like this, what hope do the rest of us have?" Back home, the people were divided. Polls showed that while 42% still supported the Prime Minister's actions, 56% believed he had gone too far. That number was rising every day. The country felt split down the middle, between those who feared government weakness and those who feared dictatorship. Families argued at dinner tables. Colleagues clashed in offices. Students debated in classrooms. The air was thick with fear and frustration. Many wondered if they were watching the collapse of something greater than a government, perhaps the collapse of trust itself. By the end of the week, the British pound dropped sharply, and investors started pulling out of the UK market. International confidence was shaken. Supermarkets reported early signs of panic buying. Gas stations in rural areas saw long queues. It wasn't just a legal crisis anymore, it was turning into an economic and social emergency. And through it all, the Prime Minister stayed mostly silent, appearing only in short, carefully staged video messages where he promised stability, strength, and national unity, but offered no direct answers. Britain had seen political scandal before. It had seen weak leaders, angry protests, and legal fights. But never like this. Never a moment where every institution, from parliament to courts to churches, felt pushed to its limit by one man's power. The fallout was not just spreading. It was consuming, and the real danger? The final court ruling hadn't even come. Yet, as Britain holds its breath, the question now is simple, but terrifying: what happens next? With the Prime Minister defiant, the courts frozen in constitutional conflict, and the public tearing itself apart, the future of the country is clouded by fear. Everyone, from top judges to factory workers, is asking, is this the end of the crisis, or the beginning of something worse? The first and most urgent scenario is the final Supreme Court ruling. If the judges rule that the Prime Minister's executive order was illegal, they will likely demand he reverse it immediately. But here lies the true danger. The Prime Minister has not promised to obey the court. In fact, several insiders say he's privately told advisors that he'll ignore any judgment that weakens the will of the people. If that happens, if a sitting Prime Minister refuses to follow a Supreme Court ruling, Britain would enter a full-blown constitutional meltdown. The government would be considered in open defiance of the rule of law. Civil servants might walk out. Police may be forced to choose between upholding court orders or obeying executive commands. The military could be dragged into political chaos. Not seen since the Civil War, another scenario is a snap general election. Under massive public pressure and rebellion inside Parliament, the Prime Minister could be forced to dissolve government and call for an election. But even this path is risky. Analysts warn that if the election becomes a law versus leader campaign, it could deepen national divisions. The Prime Minister still commands strong support in parts of the country. Rural voters and populist groups view him as a champion against bureaucracy. If he wins a new mandate, it could be seen as public approval to override the judiciary. That would not only break legal tradition, it might destroy it entirely. There's also talk of a backroom solution. Senior Tory MPs are quietly speaking to constitutional experts about removing the Prime Minister through internal party votes or formal pressure from the King. This would be unprecedented. Britain's monarchs today have almost no political power, but in extreme situations, the Crown can step in to protect the constitutional balance. However, any involvement by the King would risk turning a political crisis into a royal one. The palace has so far remained silent, only stating that it trusts the democratic process. But if Parliament collapses or the courts are ignored, that silence might not last. Meanwhile, the worst-case scenario is unrest turning violent. Already, small extremist groups, on both sides, are calling for action. Some say they'll resist any government seen as too weak to lead. Others warn they will rise against tyranny if the courts are dismissed. Intelligence agencies are monitoring chatter online, fearing flashpoints like government buildings, military sites, or power stations could be targeted. In private, one MI5 source admitted, "We're in uncharted territory." A democratic country should not be asking, will our Prime Minister obey the law? But that's exactly where we are. On the other side, there's hope, but only if the crisis is handled with care. Legal scholars believe this may force the country to finally write a clear constitution. Unlike the US, Britain has never had one formal document. Its rules are based on traditions, past rulings, and agreements. But this very crisis, this moment of danger, may become the push the country needs to secure its democratic system on paper. There is even talk in academic circles of a citizens' convention to decide once and for all how far power should go, and what must never be touched again. The public is watching closely. Polls show that more than 70% of voters now want stricter limits on executive power. People are demanding clarity, real, enforceable rules that no leader can break. Some are calling for political reform, legal reform, and even education reform, so that the next generation understands what democracy really means. And at the center of it all stands one man, silent again, calculating his next move. The Prime Minister's allies insist he's not a tyrant but a patriot. They say he's simply doing what needs to be done in difficult times. But his critics argue something very different, that he has confused leadership with control and passion with power. As one former judge put it, we don't fear the man himself. We fear what he's showing others is now possible. The next 48 hours could change everything. The Supreme Court's final ruling is expected soon. The nation waits, exhausted, angry, divided. If the Prime Minister accepts the decision, it may calm the storm. If he rejects it, Britain could see the biggest legal and political disaster since the days of empire. One thing is certain, the line between democracy and dictatorship is thinner than many thought. And right now, Britain is walking it.